The Killer Bee True Crime Series, Episode 7, Part 2, The BTK Killer. Due to the graphic nature of this killer's crimes, listener discretion is advised. This episode includes discussions of murder and assault that some people may find offensive. One night, in early January of 1991, 62-year-old Dolores Davis noticed one of her beloved cats pawing at the window as though there was something on the other side of the glass it wanted to catch. She peered out the window, but saw nothing. Then, another one of her cats caught her eye. He was jumpy, on edge, like he knew something she didn't. A shiver went down her spine. Something was not right. Dolores called her son Jeff. She told him there might be something lurking outside of her home. Jeff assured her nothing was amiss. Her imagination was just getting the better of her. He calmed her fears and said goodnight. Of course, Jeff had been mistaken. Someone was outside Dolores' window, hiding in the darkness, just out of sight. And a few days later, on January 18th, 1991, Dolores Davis became the final victim of the serial killer known as BTK. Dennis Rader began his serial killer career in 1974 when he slaughtered 4 members of the Otero family, including 2 young children. He proceeded to kill 6 additional victims in Wichita, Kansas over the next 20 years, murdering his final victim in 1991. Rader tortured and strangled helpless women and children to achieve the sexual satisfaction that he had fantasized about. But murder wasn't all he craved. Rader wanted to be as notorious as the famous serial killers he'd spent his childhood and adult life reading about. Rader's desire for fame was ultimately his undoing. Rader spent most of his youth fantasizing about tying up and torturing pretty girls. By 1974, the 28-year-old was ready to act. He targeted the Otero family after spotting the mother, Julie, in a car on Murdoch Avenue. Throughout his killing career, the randomness of his murders was one of the reasons police had so much difficulty connecting Rader to his various crime scenes. In the early morning of January 15, 1974, Rader crept to the Otero suburban home in Wichita, Kansas. He tied up, tortured, suffocated, and strangled Joe and Julie Otero, as well as their 2 children, 9-year-old Joey and 11-year-old Josie. For Rader, murder felt like pure heroin. He'd become obsessed, frenzied even. He needed to kill again. Psychologist Joni Johnson explains that serial killers are somewhat similar to addicts in the way that they give in to a compulsion in order to improve how they feel. Johnson notes, criminals can become just as addicted to their particular form of criminal activity as a heroin addict to smack or an alcoholic to alcohol. Serial killers have the same difficulty resisting their cravings. From the moment Rader first tasted blood, nothing else could truly satisfy him. Just a few weeks after killing the Oteros in January of 1974, Rader began hunting women for his next kill, or as he called it, his next project. But even as he silently stalked the women of Wichita, he kept up appearances. As a doting husband and diligent student at the University of Wichita, Rader was very good at compartmentalizing his different personas, and like many psychopaths, he felt no guilt about lying to his family. In fact, Rader spotted his next victim, Catherine Bright, while he was taking his wife Paula out for lunch. In the spring of 1974, Catherine Bright was a 21-year-old student at the University of Kansas. She was very close to her 4 siblings, and even though she lived alone in her suburban home on 13th Street, her 19-year-old brother Kevin often came to visit. Rader had a couple of reasons for targeting Catherine. She was slim, with long blonde hair, his preferred type. But Rader also targeted Catherine Bright in part because of his obsession with the number 3, which he believed to be supernaturally lucky. Her house was on 13th Street, and her address was 3127. Started with a 3. An obsession with numbers or rituals can be a symptom of obsessive-compulsive disorder, or OCD. For someone with the disorder, some numbers could be good, and others bad, and needed to be avoided at all costs. Rader was later evaluated by psychologist Robert Mendoza. Mendoza noted Rader's OCD tendencies, but didn't believe they reached the clinical level where they would significantly impact his day-to-day activities. Rader spent weeks stalking Catherine, making sure she lived alone. Ever the perfectionist, Rader also began obsessively squeezing a stress ball trying to work up his hand strength. He had failed to successfully strangle the Oturos on the first try, and wasn't about to make the same mistake twice. He came up with a story so Catherine would let him in. He decided to pose as a fellow college student, looking for help with homework. Since he really was a college student, it would be an easy role to pull off. Rader assembled weapons for the murder: his buck knife, a .22 caliber Colt, and a Colt .357 Magnum. For some reason, he didn't bring the hit kit that he usually brought along to each victim's house. He hid the weapons in his large Air Force jacket and brought gloves so he wouldn't leave fingerprints behind. And he also chose a nickname for his murder project: Lights Out. Rader came up with a variety of code words or nicknames for his murder-related paraphernalia. He thought it would throw his wife off his scent should she stumble across his work. It also allowed him to entertain a fantasy of being a secret agent. He liked to write notes and stories about his victims that only he could understand. On April 4th, 1974, Rader drove his car to Wichita State University campus and parked it there. Catherine lived within walking distance of the college, so he was able to easily make his way over to her home on foot. He saw Catherine's car sitting in her driveway and assumed she was home. He put his gloves on, but ultimately decided against the ski mask. He knocked on Catherine's door, but she didn't answer. After a few moments, he realized she must have gone somewhere on foot, so he broke a kitchen window in the back of the house and clambered inside. Indeed, Catherine wasn't home. He swept up the broken glass and tidied up the kitchen so as not to arouse suspicion before he walked into her bedroom. He walked down the hallway toward her bedroom. Nervous, he pulled out his gun and fiddled with it. By accident, he fired a round into Catherine's bathroom door. Nothing seemed to be going right for Rader, and the situation became even dicier when the front door opened. Catherine was home, but she wasn't alone. Her 19-year-old brother Kevin was with her. Panicked, Rader quickly drew his gun and confronted the siblings. He fell back on an old, familiar story. He was a fugitive on the run who just wanted to tie them up and rob them. But Rader hadn't bothered to bring his kit. He didn't have anything to tie them up with. He kept Catherine and Kevin at gunpoint and ordered them into Catherine's bedroom with his gun trained on them. He rifled through her dresser drawers until he found bandanas and other clothing items that he could use to bind them. Rader forced Kevin to tie his sister's hands so she wouldn't fight back. Then, he bound Kevin to the bedpost. Rader dragged Catherine into a separate bedroom and tied her to a chair. He decided to kill Kevin first, since he considered the brother to be a bigger threat. He turned on the radio and blasted music so Catherine wouldn't hear him throttling her brother. But when Rader wrapped a cord around Kevin's throat, the young man ripped free of his bindings. Kevin fought for his life. But Rader pulled out his gun and fired at the teenager's head. Kevin collapsed to the floor, seemingly dead. Catherine heard the gunshot from the next room and started screaming for her brother. Rader rushed in and tried to reassure her that Kevin was fine and he would let both siblings go. Soon, Catherine wasn't having any of it. She struggled desperately against her bindings. Rader tried to strangle Catherine, but she continued to fight. Rader got nervous. Catherine was proving harder to kill than he anticipated. He decided to take a moment and regroup. He'd go double-check that Kevin was indeed dead. It might seem like an odd thing to do, but again, BTK didn't have a great track record on first-try kills. He returned to the other room, where Kevin lay on the floor, and kicked the boy's corpse. But Kevin was just playing dead. He sprung at Rader, and the two fought for control of Rader's gun. Kevin was slight, 5'6" and only 115 pounds. Rader, at 5'11", was easily able to overpower the teen. He shot Kevin in the face, and Kevin dropped to the floor. Rader returned to the other bedroom, where Catherine was still trying to loosen her bindings, and he tried to strangle her, but Catherine managed to free herself from the chair. Before Catherine could get away, Rader pulled out his hunting knife and stabbed the young woman. She tried to run, but Rader stabbed her 10 more times until she collapsed to the ground. The room's walls and floor were coated with her blood, but Catherine was still clinging to life. Rader heard something strange. He hurried back to the other bedroom, and Kevin was gone. The teen, who had sustained 2 bullet wounds to the head, had run out the front door. Rader didn't have time to finish Catherine. The police might be coming at any minute. He grabbed Catherine's driver's license and a few other odds and ends, acting as trophies. and then fled for his life. Many serial killers take trophies so they can later relive and fantasize about the murder. This was certainly the case with Rader. He had a vivid imagination, enjoyed recreating the murders. He often played the role of the bound victim. Police later recovered photographs of Rader, clothed in only his victim's bras and undergarments. With his trophy in hand, Rader raced back to his car, his lungs aching. He drove back to his childhood home and hid the trophies in a tackle box. He hid his weapons and bloody clothes in his parents' garage attic and the old chicken coop. Meanwhile, after escaping Rader, Kevin stumbled through the front door of Catherine's neighbor. He explained there was an attacker in his sister's home, and the neighbors quickly phoned the police. Catherine was still alive when the cops arrived. They rushed both Catherine and Kevin to the hospital, but Catherine died later that day. Kevin tried to give police a description of his attacker, though he had problems talking. Rader had shot him in the jaw, and he had choked on his own blood when he tried to talk. He managed to tell the police that Rader was around 5'11", and he was wearing a distinctive silver watch. Kevin was describing the watch Rader had stolen from Joe Arturo, his previous murder victim. But, despite Kevin's eyewitness account, police weren't able to locate Rader. They couldn't even agree on the identity of the murderer. Some investigators believed that Catherine and the Oturos were slaughtered by the same killer, while others thought that Oturos were most likely killed by drug dealers. Rader was thrilled when he realized the police had no idea who he was. But this wasn't good enough for him. He wanted to be a famous serial killer, like the ones he'd read about as a teen. And if he was going to be a famous serial killer, he needed a signature name. In October of 1974, Rader left a taunting letter to police in a library book, then called the local newspaper so they could locate his note. It contained shocking details about the Arturo murders. Only the killer would know. Rader's letter was signed BTK, and it stood for his modus operandi: bind them, torture them, kill them. By the fall of 1974, Dennis Rader had claimed his first 5 victims in Wichita, Kansas. In October, he left a mocking letter to police and revealed the nickname he had chosen for himself, BTK. He also kept up his persona as an ordinary citizen of Wichita. He continued to attend college classes in the fall of 1974 and started working for ADT Security Services. Rader was amused to find himself installing security systems in the homes of people afraid of the BTK killer. Rader also made sure to keep playing the role of the loving husband. He also later claimed that he genuinely cared about his wife, and he enjoyed their sex life. But his fantasies of strangling women were still more important to him than anything else. Professor of criminal psychology Catherine Ramsland notes the fantasy was a crucial coping mechanism for Rader. It gave him an escape from life's everyday stresses. While some of us may go for a hike or play video games, Rader liked to tie up dolls or draw frightened women bound up with rope. As part of his fantasies, he eventually started taking pictures of himself, tied up as though he was his own victim. At least once, he encased himself in plastic, pretended to bury himself in a freshly dug grave. The link between fantasy and serial murder isn't unique to Rader either. Criminology professor Scott Bunn notes that many serial killers have intense fantasy lives. They imagine killing their victims as a way of ramping up to committing murder in real life. Rader hid these fantasies from Paula, pretending he was satisfied with their marriage. And, in an odd way, he was. They were an otherwise normal couple. In late 1974, she became pregnant with their first son, Brian, who was born in July of 1975. Paula stayed at home with the new baby, while Rader supported the family through his work at ADT. But even though he acted like a contented family man in public, Rader was always looking for his next victim. He spent the next 2 years stalking women in Wichita. In March of 1977, he zeroed in on his next project. Rader was still obsessed with the number 3, and he believed March was a good month for his next kill because it was the 3rd month of the year. His intended target that day was a woman who lived on South Greenwood. He nicknamed her project Project Green. On March 17, 1977, Rader knocked on the woman's front door. His kit was hidden in a briefcase, but she didn't answer. Down but not out, Rader wandered around the neighborhood, looking for a different victim. On South Hydraulic Street, He ran into a 5-year-old boy named Stephen Vane. He was bringing his mother Shirley a can of soup from the grocery store for lunch. The whole family had come down with the flu, and Shirley wasn't well enough to run to the store herself. Rader pondered whether the boy's mother could be a substitute target. He showed Stephen a photo of Paula and his young son Brian. He claimed they were missing and asked Stephen if he'd seen them. It's not clear why Rader bothered with such an elaborate lie. He could have just followed the boy home. Perhaps he simply just enjoyed playing the role as a detective. Stephen told Rader that he hadn't seen the people in the photo. Rader pressed the child and said, "Are you sure? Look again." But the little boy repeated, "No, sir," and continued down the street to his home. Rader kept an eye on the boy as he knocked on the door of another possible victim he'd been stalking, Cheryl Gilmore. He later told police that he had nicknamed Cheryl Project Blackout because that was the name of a bar she frequented. But Cheryl didn't answer, and he waited on her stoop. Rader watched 5-year-old Stephen enter the house 2 doors down at 1311 South Hydraulic. The boy's address had a 3 in it, Rader's favorite number. He decided to go for it. Inside the home, Stephen didn't feel like playing with his 8-year-old brother Bud or his 4-year-old sister Stephanie. He laid in his mother Shirley's bed to keep company until he heard Rader knocking at the door. Stephen and Bud raced each other to the front door. 5-year-old Stephen won the race, a moment he would regret forever. Stephen opened the door to find Rader staring down at him. Rader told the kids that he was a private detective. When their mother Shirley dragged herself out of the bed to see who was at the door, Rader grew excited. He repeated the lie to Shirley and stepped inside the house. As soon as he was inside the house, Rader pulled out his gun and shut all the blinds. Shirley begged Rader not to hurt her or the kids. Rader quickly came up with a story to calm her down. He claimed he just wanted to tie Shirley up and take bondage pictures. If she cooperated, everyone would be fine. The phone rang, but Rader ordered the family not to answer it. Shirley once again begged Rader not to hurt her or the kids, but Rader ignored it. He took rope out of his briefcase and tried to tie up Bud. When the 8-year-old cried, Rader decided it was too much trouble to tie up each of Shirley's 3 kids individually, and the phone call began to worry him. Someone might be on their way to her house. He hurriedly put Bud, Stephen, and Stephanie in the bathroom. He chucked blankets and toys into the bathroom to keep the kids busy. Then he quickly tied the bathroom door shut with rope. Rader hoped he didn't have to rush everything too much if he had time to spare. He wanted to suffocate the young boys with plastic bags and strangle the 4-year-old. Rader dragged Shirley into the bedroom, away from her sobbing children. She didn't fight back, desperately hoping that if she cooperated with Rader, he would rape her and leave. It wasn't until Rader placed a bag over her head and tied the rope around her neck that Shirley realized she was about to die. The children were frantic. They knew their mother was in danger, but they didn't know how to help her. 5-year-old Stephen screamed that he would untie the rope, keeping the bathroom door closed, but Rader warned the child that if he did, he'd shoot him in the head. Stephen, Bud, and Stephanie were too terrified to leave the bathroom. As a psychopath, Rader felt no guilt over his actions. It didn't bother him at all to hear the children's cries. In fact, it only confirmed his control of the situation. After Shirley was dead, Rader thought about killing the 3 young children, still trapped in the bathroom, but his thoughts kept returning to the phone call. He decided not to chance it. Rader grabbed 2 pairs of Shirley's underwear as trophies and fled the home. Eventually, 8-year-old Bud smashed open the bedroom window so the 3 siblings could escape to the yard. The children ran through the unlocked front door to their mother's bedroom, only to discover her dead in her bed. Hysterical, the children raced to their neighbor's house, and the neighbor called the police. Rader was worried that the children would be able to identify him, but the descriptions the children gave weren't good enough for the cops to track Rader down. However, several officers did notice similarities between Shirley's death and the murders of the Otero family. Both had been bound up in intricate knots, and at both crime scenes, the victims were suffocated with bags over their heads. But they still didn't have enough information to find Rader. Rader had now killed 6 people, and he was starting to feel invincible. Catherine Ramsland described Rader as suffering from a condition called narcissistic immunity. She says that Rader became convinced that he was smarter than the detectives trying to catch him. He believed he could get away with anything. The high from killing Shirley Vane didn't last long, and Rader spent the rest of 1977 looking for his next victim. He often scoped out women during the day, while he was installing security systems for ADT. In the winter of 1977, Rader spotted his next target, 25-year-old Nancy Fox. He was pleased to learn that Nancy lived alone at 843 South Pershing. That meant there would hopefully be no dogs, no kids, no siblings, and no husband to contend with. He nicknamed this project Project Foxtail. On December 8th, he warned his wife he'd be studying late at the library. He spent a couple hours there working on a paper for one of his college classes. But around 9 p.m., he left the library and drove to Nancy's duplex with his kit. He knocked on Nancy's door to make sure she wasn't home. Then he went out back and cut the phone line. He smashed open a window and scrambled into the apartment. He waited for her to return from her evening shift at Hillsborough Jewelers. He'd memorized her entire schedule and knew exactly when she would be home. Rader drank a glass of water, a tradition that he'd started when he'd murdered the Otero family. He put Nancy's phone to his ear to double-check that it was dead. Right then, Nancy walked into her apartment. We don't know for sure how Nancy reacted when she spotted Rader in her living room. In one version of Rader's story, Nancy was defiant when Rader pulled the gun on her. In another version, she was terrified from the get-go. In all versions, Rader told Nancy he just wanted to have sex with her and then let her go. Nancy asked if she could use the bathroom first. When Nancy came out of the bathroom, Rader handcuffed her and forced her to lie face down on the bed. Then he strangled her with a belt until she fell unconscious. But Rader wasn't done. He derived special pleasure out of psychologically torturing his victims and wanted to prolong Nancy's agony as much as possible. He waited until Nancy stirred, then leaned close to her ear and whispered he was BTK. He'd already killed 6 victims, and now it was Nancy's turn. Nancy fought desperately, but she wasn't strong enough to throw off Rader. He strangled her to death. As Rader watched Nancy take her final breaths, he masturbated into her blue nightgown. Rader then cleaned up the apartment. He also stole Nancy's clothes, jewelry, and driver's licenses trophies. He was proud of this murder, where everything had gone according to plan. So much, in fact, he couldn't wait for someone to discover his perfect crime. The next day, he called the police himself. The next morning, on December 9th, Rader dialed 911 from a payphone and told the dispatcher that the police could find Nancy's body at 843 South Pershing. The dispatcher was confused and tried to ask follow-up questions, but Rader had abandoned the phone and left the receiver hanging. By chance, a firefighter entered the phone booth just as Rader was leaving. He tried to describe Rader to the detectives who found Nancy's body, but he didn't get a good enough look. He estimated Rader was maybe 6 feet tall and had blonde hair. It wasn't enough evidence for the detectives to go on, so the case went cold. Rader was thrilled Wichita detectives weren't able to locate him. Even after he'd been brazen enough to report his own crime, he felt infallibly cocky, enough to take chances. He'd sent a poem that he had written about Shirley Vane to the local paper, the Wichita Eagle, but he was disappointed when they didn't publish anything about BTK. So Rader sent a poem about Nancy's death to a local TV station. Rader had slightly rewritten the folk song, "Oh Death," in reference to Nancy's murder, and titled it, quote, "Oh Death to Nancy," end quote. Along with the revised song lyrics, he sent a drawing of Nancy and signed it with BTK. He also sent the note that he'd sent to the Wichita Eagle, his poem about Shirley Vane. This prompted the station to hand it over to police. Rader was frustrated that the police didn't realize they were dealing with a serial killer, so he decided to connect the dots for them. He laid out the similarities between his victims in his typo-filled letter. He wrote, quote, "Golly gee, yes, the MO is different in each, but look, a pattern is developing. The victims are tied up. Most have been women. Phone cut. Bring some bondage material. Sadistic tendencies. No struggle outside the death spot. No witnesses except the Vane kids. They were very lucky. Phone calls saved them." End quote. Rader later admitted he got a thrill out of playing games with the police. The risk and the subsequent media attention, they were intoxicating. But soon, Rader became too preoccupied to write taunting letters to the media. His daughter, Carrie Rader, was born on June 13, 1978. His growing family now took up most of his time. He spent what little free time he had looking for his next victim. And a little less than a year later, April 1979, he found her. Anna Williams, 63, living alone in Wichita after her husband had died. but she was close to her 24-year-old granddaughter Rebecca, who often stayed with her. Rader spotted Rebecca staying at the house and believed she was the primary resident, and when he looked up the name of the homeowner, he came to believe that Rebecca was actually Anna. He decided Rebecca would be the next victim and nicknamed her project Pine Cone because she lived at 615 South Pinecrest. On the evening of April 28th, he decided to carry out the murder. He cut the phone line and broke into the house. Then he looked for Rebecca, but neither she nor Anna were home. He set up camp and no one came home. Rader couldn't stay out too late. He told his wife he was taking night classes, but that only bought him so much time. Eventually, Rader gave up. He stole some jewelry, some clothing, and a sock with $30 in it. He also scribbled a threatening message on Anna's bedroom mirror. In her lipstick, Rader had written, "BTK was here." And with that, he left. Despite Rader's failure to kill Anna, he still craved attention for the murder he almost committed. He had a deep-seated need for admiration, and it encouraged him to play risky games with the media once again. On June 14th, he sent dual packages to both the TV station and Anna Williams' home. Anna's adult daughter, Rebecca's mom, opened the package. What she found was beyond disturbing. Inside was a drawing of a naked woman, tied to the bed with one of the scarves that had been stolen from Anna's house, and a poem entitled, "Oh Anna, why didn't you appear?" The poem, which was full of typos, Rader lamented the fact that Anna wasn't his 8th murder victim. Anna was so terrified to learn her house had been broken into by BTK, she left Wichita entirely. Meanwhile, Rader graduated from college in May 1979. He spent some time focusing on his family. He got his children a puppy named Patches, but through his work with ADT, he was sometimes sent out of town and stayed in hotels. When he was at a hotel, he would engage in what he called hotel parties. He would hold up in the motel room, pretending to be his own victim. He often handcuffed himself or tied himself up while wearing his female victim's clothing. Sometimes he wore a creepy mask of a woman's face over his head, along with his victim's bras and lacy undergarments. He loved to place plastic bags over his head and hang himself. He almost suffocated himself a couple times, so he started keeping one hand free to make sure that he didn't. He took pictures of himself, tied up and choking, which he found highly erotic. People who hang themselves or otherwise cut off their oxygen supply to achieve an orgasm have an unusual condition called asphyxiophilia. It isn't just serial killers who develop this condition. Psychologist Mark Griffith notes several celebrities have accidentally killed themselves while practicing this, including actor David Carradine, who died in his hotel room closet. But Rader's hotel room fantasies weren't actually as satisfying as murders. Family responsibilities kept him from settling on a victim. This lasted for several years after his failed attempt at killing Anna Williams in 1979, but he continued to stalk women. He was window shopping, if you will. By April 1985, he was 40 years old, not quite as spry as he used to be. He picked an easy target that didn't require much stalking or detective work. His 53-year-old neighbor, Maureen Hedge. He called her Project Cookie because she worked as a local chef. His 9-year-old son Brian had been in the Boy Scouts now for 2 years, and Rader had become a scout leader. On April 26, the Scouts were having a camping trip, and Rader knew this would give him the free time to commit the murder. He spent the next evening of April 26 at the campgrounds with the other Boy Scout fathers. He told them he was tired and going to bed. With no one watching him in the tent, he was able to sneak out to his car and drive to the bowling alley. He pretended to be drunk and got a taxi to drive him to his neighborhood. The taxi dropped him off a block away from Maureen's home. He snuck through the backyard of his wife's parents to reach Maureen's home. Then he cut her phone lines. He broke in and waited. But when he heard Maureen arriving home with a male friend, he hid in a closet. After an hour, Maureen's friend left, and Maureen went to bed. She had no idea there was a monster waiting just a few feet away. She woke up to her neighbor Rader choking the life out of her. After Rader finished killing Maureen, he tied her up to engage in twisted sexual fantasies. For some reason, it wasn't enough for him to take pictures of Maureen in her bedroom. He wanted to take pictures of her corpse in his church. The only explanation he ever offered police was that he had a mean streak. Rader hid Maureen's body in a blanket and transported her to his Lutheran church in his car. He took photos of her bound corpse in the church's classrooms, grotesquely positioning her limbs like she was a doll. Rader then dumped Maureen's body in a ditch, abandoned her car, and drove his own car back to the Boy Scout camp. The other Boy Scout fathers never even noticed he was missing. The police never suspected Rader for Maureen's murder. Instead, many believe Maureen's male friend, the last one to see her alive, was the one that killed her. When his wife and neighbors gossiped about Maureen's friend, Rader insisted he wasn't the killer. Perhaps because he couldn't stand the idea of someone else getting the credit for one of his murders. Between Rader's family commitments and his career, he had little time to devote to killing. It wasn't until a year later, in September of 1986, that Rader selected his next target, 28-year-old Vicki Wegerly. He picked her for a couple reasons. She was young, blonde, and an excellent pianist who was generally home alone every day, parenting her 2-year-old son. And her house had a covered porch so no one would see Rader coming or going. Rader listened to Vicki play piano as he stalked her. He liked her playing so much, he named her Project Piano. On September 16th, he knocked on Vicki's door, posing as a telephone repairman. As soon as she let him inside, Rader pulled his gun on her and forced her into the bedroom. He strangled her, but Vicki fought back, scratching Rader's face and permanently scarring him. Nevertheless, he managed to kill her. He took 3 photos of Vicki's corpse with trophies and grabbed her driver's license before leaving. He didn't strangle Vicki's 2-year-old son, mainly because the boy had been in the living room and he hadn't witnessed the murder. Sadly, the police didn't realize Vicki was killed by BTK, and for decades they suspected that her husband, Bill, had murdered her. After killing Vicki in 1986, Rader struggled to keep his murderous compulsions under control. Police were starting to make use of DNA evidence, and by the late 1980s, Rader knew he needed to be more careful. From the late 80s until the beginning of the 1990s, Rader tried to fulfill his needs with motel parties, but he could only tamp down his desire to kill for so long. January 18, 1991, Rader committed his fatal murder. Once again, he used one of his son Brian's Boy Scout camping trips as cover. He snuck away from the camp and drove to the house of 62-year-old Dolores Davis, a beloved mother and grandmother. He then broke in and strangled her with a pair of pantyhose. Rader dumped Dolores' body under a bridge and left a creepy porcelain mask by her corpse. The young boy discovered her decomposing corpse weeks later, on February 1st. The police had no leads. In May of 1991, Rader started his new job as a compliance officer and took delight in handing out citations. Rader began stalking his neighbor, Barbara Walters, a former auditor for the IRS, looking for any reason to give her a citation. On August 3, 1993, Rader spotted her black dog named Shadow in her backyard. He vaulted over the backyard fence, unlocked the gate, and let the dog run free. Rader then issued a $25 fine to Barbara, insisting she was the one that let Shadow roam the neighborhood. Barbara realized that Rader was aiming to have Shadow put down, so she fought the citation in court. Rader brought in an enormous file on evidence he'd collected against Shadow. To Barbara's horror, Rader won the case. She appealed to a higher court, and it fortunately saved her dog, but Rader's obsessive stalking of his neighbors continued. He scrutinized every neighbor's house for lawn or minor violations, even going as far as measuring the grass height of a sick neighbor that was too sick and weak to mow their yard. He also continued to go after the neighborhood dogs, succeeding in getting a few put to sleep. Around 1994 or 95, Rader began stalking women again, contemplating potential victims, but family obligations soon inhibited him from murdering. His father died in 1996. Rader became his mother's primary caregiver. All was quiet for nearly a decade, but then, in January 2004, a reporter released an article about BTK on the 30-year anniversary of the murders of the Toro family. He described BTK as a killer that few in Wichita even remembered. 59-year-old Rader wasn't going to let that stand. It was time for him to start his games with the police again. He sent a package to a local news station on May 4, 2004, under the name Bill Thomas Killman, whose initials spelled out BTK. Inside the package were Vicki Wegerly's driver's license. Wichita detectives realized that this was finally their chance to catch the serial killer. They just needed to draw BTK out. Over the course of 2004, Rader sent several more packages to the media, reveling in the renewed attention to BTK. He even contemplated upping the ante by murdering an 11th victim, but he backed out at the last minute, noticing a construction crew working outside her home. Rader never named his 11th intended victim, but his fellow code compliance officer, Mary Capps, later said in interviews she believed it was her that was Rader's target. Meanwhile, the police continued to coax Rader into communicating with them, hoping he would make a mistake. And, in February of 2005, their plan paid off. Rader was finding his game with the police to be a lot of work, and he was sick of photocopying notes. He figured he could simplify things by sending a taunting message on a floppy drive. Rader left the police a message in a trash bin near a Home Depot in Wichita. The note asked, quote, "Can I communicate with a floppy and not be traced to a computer? Be honest." End quote. Per Rader's request, the police then left a coded message in a local newspaper that said, quote, "Rex, it will be okay." End quote. Rader naively assumed the police wouldn't lie. On February 16th of 2005, he sent a floppy disk to the local media, who turned it over to the police. By recovering and analyzing the data on Rader's disk, police figured out they were looking for a man named Dennis, who had been using a computer at Christ Lutheran Church. Upon further investigation, they learned that a man named Dennis Rader had been elected the church's president. Investigators wanted to compare the DNA taken from the crime scenes to Rader's DNA, but they didn't want to tip him off. Luckily, Wichita State University Student Health Center still had his daughter Carrie Rader's pap smear on file, and detectives were able to obtain her DNA through subpoena. When investigators compared the crime scene DNA to Carrie's DNA, they found a match. The killer was Carrie's father, Dennis Rader. Wichita police spied on Rader, memorizing his schedule, and on February 25, 2005, they arrested him during his lunch hour. Rader was quickly able to guess why they were pulling him over and politely greeted the detectives. However, he later mentioned that he wished he'd been able to shoot the detectives and escape, much like James Bond might. Author's note: the FBI has interviewed cop killers in prison, asking them why did they kill one police officer and not another. The common response is, "They didn't let me." This is the main reason why officers pay very close attention to officer safety when dealing with suspects. Rader confessed as soon as he learned that detectives had positive DNA match. In fact, he later admitted to Catherine Ramslin that he probably bragged a bit too much. Rader insisted that he wasn't a bad person. He told detectives, quote, "Normally I'm a pretty nice guy. I'm sorry, but I am." End quote. Rader also led police to many of what he called his hidey holes, or places where he stored his trophies. They recovered articles of clothing, photos of victims bound and gagged, photos Rader had taken himself, tied up and wearing his victims' clothing. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Police said after the initial interviews with Rader, they obtained a search warrant and found the killer's own crime scene photos and his stash of personal effects he'd taken as trophies. They also found pages and stories he had written in detail describing his killings. Rader was evaluated to stand trial. Dr. Mendoza noted Rader's obsession with patterns and numbers, his stubbornness, his manipulative tendencies, his lack of empathy, and narcissistic traits. However, we found Rader fully competent. But Rader decided he didn't want a trial, either because he wanted to make things easier for his wife and kids, or because he knew he would be convicted regardless. On June 27, 2005, he pled guilty to all 10 murders. But the judge didn't want to let him go so easily. He forced Rader to give an account of every single one of his murders to provide closure on these cases. As Rader confessed to these murders, he kept making strange noises with his mouth. The detectives who caught Rader were both irritated and humiliated. He was coming off like some kind of bumbling idiot, and they feared he was making them look stupid. Nevertheless, Rader was sentenced to 10 life sentences, or 175 years minimum. Today, he still resides at El Dorado Correctional Facility, a maximum security prison near Wichita. Rader's wife Paula and his 2 children initially had trouble believing he was really the serial killer, but after Rader confessed, they were disgusted, horrified, and traumatized. Paula never spoke to her husband again. Rader's adult daughter Carrie struggled to reconcile her childhood memories of a loving, attentive father with the loathsome murderer he really was. She was terrified she might end up like him. Rader had spent the past decade analyzing and reanalyzing his own psyche, wondering what drives him to kill. He corroborated on a book about his psychology, saying that he had disturbed sexual needs, a desire to control others, and a deep-seated wish to be infamous. And, in a way, he got his wish. Since his capture in 2005, Rader's name has become infamous. and he was thrilled when Stephen King published A Good Marriage, a novella inspired by Rader's exploits. In 2010, however, Rader botched almost every murder he planned. He handed the police evidence that damned him, and while he did achieve infamy during his trial, the name BTK is already beginning to fade from public memory. For all his efforts, Dennis Rader will die in prison, forgotten and alone. This has been the Killer Bee True Crime Series, Episode 7, Part 2. Thank you for listening, and God bless.